How did a secret occult order obsessed with hidden knowledge end up intersecting with ideas that helped shape some of the darkest ideologies of the 20th century? The British Empire stood at the height of its power. Science and industry were transforming the world at an astonishing pace. Old certainties were collapsing, new discoveries were rewriting humanity's understanding of nature, and for many educated people, religion no longer seemed capable of answering every question. But something strange was happening. At the exact moment society appeared to be moving toward reason, technology, and modernity, parts of the intellectual elite became obsessed with the mystical. The secret societies began to flourish across Europe and America. Esoteric philosophy spread through private circles. Educated men and women, doctors, writers, scholars, aristocrats, and artists began searching for hidden truths in ancient symbols, forbidden teachings, ritual magic, astrology, alchemy, and forgotten religious systems. Some believed humanity had lost access to ancient wisdom. Others believed hidden knowledge could transform the inner self. And some believed history itself was shaped by forces most people could never see. And then in 1888, a secretive organization emerged in London that promised access to all of it.
I walk through silence, thick and cold, where shadows drift and time grows old. No voice to call, no path to take, just fog and fear with every ache. Souls in the fog.
The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn enters the Victorian chat, but this was no social club. It claimed to offer a path toward hidden enlightenment, a structured system of initiation built around ancient symbolism, ceremonial ritual, mystical philosophy, secret knowledge that was allegedly preserved across centuries. Its members would eventually include poets, intellectuals, mystics, social elites, and some of the most controversial occult figures in modern history. At first glance, the story of the Golden Dawn sounds eccentric. A collection of educated Victorians experimenting with elaborate rituals and hidden teachings. But beneath the secrecy lies a more disturbing question. Because as Europe moved into the 20th century, ideas about hierarchy, human development, bloodlines, higher and lower people, spiritual destiny, racial identity, and social engineering, all of these things began spreading through intellectual, political, scientific, and occult circles alike. Some of these ideas were presented as science, some as philosophy, and some as a spiritual truth. And eventually, some would become policies. So what exactly was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn? Who joined? What did they believe? And how did ideas circulating through occult and intellectual movements begin intersecting with the darker ideologies that would later emerge in Europe? Well, to understand that story, we first need to understand the strange world that made the Golden Dawn possible. To understand why the Golden Dawn appeared when it did, we first have to understand the world that created it. On paper, late 19th century Britain should have been leaving mysticism behind. This was the age of invention. Factories were expanding across Europe. Railroads connected entire nations. You had telegraphs allowing communications across continents. Medicine was advancing. Science seemed unstoppable. And yet, beneath all of the progress, something unexpected was happening. People were becoming fascinated with the supernatural. And not just ordinary people, but the educated people, the doctors, the lawyers, the writers, the scientists, the politicians, and the aristocrats. Some of the most respected minds in Europe began asking uncomfortable questions. What if science explained how the world worked, but not why? What happened to the soul? Could consciousness survive death? Were ancient civilizations in possession of knowledge that modern humanity had forgotten? Could hidden truths exist beyond ordinary perception? These questions fueled an explosion of an interest in the spiritual worlds. Seances became fashionable. Mediums claimed to communicate with the dead, whether you believe them or not. Private parlors filled with people attempting spirit communication through table rapping, automatic writing, elaborate rituals that were meant to contact these unseen forces. And at the same time, older traditions were being rediscovered. Alchemy, mysticism, sacred geometry, esoteric Christianity, the Jewish Kabbalah, Hermetic philosophy, ancient Egyptian symbolism. Occult literature that had once remained hidden in obscure manuscripts began circulating among educated readers. Secret societies began to flourish. Some promised philosophical enlightenment. Others claimed to preserve ancient wisdom passed down through hidden initiates. Organizations inspired by Rosicrucian traditions appeared. Fraternal orders expanded. Freemasonry attracted members across social classes and political influence. And for some, these groups offered meaning in a rapidly changing world. For others, the exclusivity itself became the attraction. Membership meant access to knowledge, access to influence, access to a hidden world that most people would never see. Does that sound familiar? Something else was happening too. Victorian society had become obsessed with classification, with ranking, order, measurement. Scientists categorized species, empires categorized races and populations. Intellectuals debated civilization, heredity, progress, and degeneration. Who advanced society? Who weakened it? Could human beings improve themselves? Could civilization itself evolve? And at first, many of these questions seemed philosophical and even hopeful. But over time, some ideas would become darker. The language of improvement would slowly merge with ideas of superiority. The language of evolution would begin merging with hierarchy. And in certain circles, spiritual advancement and human ranking started to overlap in some unsettling ways. Not everywhere and not all at once, but enough that a pattern begins to emerge. If you believed hidden truths governed reality and that some people possessed greater access to truth than others, then an uncomfortable idea starts to appear. What if humanity itself could be divided into higher and lower forms? The idea would eventually take many shapes. Some were scientific, some political, some mystical. And in 1888, one secret society arrived promising a system designed to reveal hidden laws governing both the universe and human potential. Its founders claimed that they had discovered something extraordinary, a hidden system of knowledge, a secret inheritance, possibly ancient, and, depending on who you believe, possibly one of the strangest origin stories in occult history. It is one of my favorites anyways. These people were interesting. So the organization called itself the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But where exactly did it come from, and who were its creators? Well, every secret society has an origin story, and the one surrounding the Golden Dawn begins with a discovery so strange that depending on who you ask, it either uncovered hidden knowledge or it opened a door to something far stranger. Now, sometime in the late 19th century, a collection of unusual handwritten papers surfaced in occult circles in Britain. At first glance, they looked insignificant. Pages of symbols, cryptic instructions, fragments of rituals, the odd diagrams, and most curious of all, code. The documents appeared encrypted, deliberately hidden from ordinary eyes. To most people, they would have looked like nonsense. But to a small group of men already fascinated by mysticism, secret knowledge, and ancient wisdom, they looked like a map. A map pointing somewhere hidden. One of the men who became fascinated with these mysterious papers was named William Wynne Westcott. And he was a respected London coroner by profession, a scholar of occult traditions by obsession. And Westcott reportedly believed the strange documents described something extraordinary, a structured path into hidden knowledge preserved through sacred teachings. But the manuscripts contained something even stranger. Buried inside the coded text appeared to be the name and address of a woman in Germany. A woman allegedly connected to an esoteric order operating quietly somewhere in Europe. Germany, probably, since she lives there. According to later accounts, Westcott reached out, and what happened next would become legend. Permission was granted, authorization supposedly from a hidden initiates to establish new temples in Britain. A place where seekers could study forgotten truths concealed from ordinary society. Soon, Westcott joined forces with two other men, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, brilliant, intense, very theatrical, and utterly consumed by the ideals of ceremonial magic. Mathers carried himself less like a Victorian scholar and more like someone who believed he stood with one foot in another world. The third founder was William Robert Woodman. Now, he was a physician and an occult scholar tied to the Rosicrucians and esoteric study. And together in 1888, they founded something secretive, something exclusive, hidden behind initiation and symbolism, a society called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This was not advertised. There were no public meetings. There were no newspaper announcements, no invitations for the curious. Entry required sponsorships, secrecy, and commitment. And once inside, members entered a world governed by ritual, symbolism, and hidden ranks. Knowledge came in layers, secrets earned, never given. The members would advance step by step through ceremonies designed to reveal hidden truths about the universe, about themselves, and everything else. Ancient Egypt, mysticism, alchemy, astrology, sacred geometry, ceremonial magic, fragments of forgotten religious systems, all stitched together into something ancient-looking and still strangely modern. And for the people drawn to it, this wasn't a fantasy. This was a system. This was a discipline. This was a spiritual path. The promise was intoxicating. Hidden knowledge existed. The universe had structure. Reality concealed secrets. And if you were disciplined enough and worthy enough, you might learn them. Before long, word spread quietly through the elite circles. Writers arrived, artists, doctors, mystics, scholars, people searching for something science alone could not explain. And among them would be figures whose names still echo through history. Some were brilliant, some were infamous, some were absolutely obsessed. And eventually, one man would walk through its doors and turn whispered secrecy into open public chaos. To outsiders, the Golden Dawn was almost invisible. A rumor, a whisper passed quietly between intellectuals, occult enthusiasts, and members of elite social circles. But inside, it was an entire world, and much of that world would have felt strangely familiar to another kind of initiate. Because the men who founded the order were not building something from nothing. All three of the founders, Westcott, Mathers, and Woodman, were deeply connected to fraternal traditions and high-ranking Masonic circles. They understood secrecy and initiation. And they understood hierarchy, ritual, structural advancement. And when they built the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they borrowed heavily from that framework. The organization ran through ranks, grades, ceremonies, and progression. Knowledge was compartmentalized. Members didn't simply walk in and receive answers. You advanced, step by step. Each stage unlocking new teachings, responsibilities, symbols, and authority. Like Freemasonry, ritual mattered, titles mattered, and the procedure mattered. Everything had order. Everything had meaning. Even the rooms themselves. A newcomer entering the Golden Dawn Temple would not find chaos or theatrical improvisation. The experience was carefully designed, symbols positioned deliberately, objects arranged with purpose, words were memorized, movements rehearsed. Initiation ceremonies guided members through symbolic journeys intended to represent death, rebirth, wisdom, purification, and spiritual awakening. None of it was random. The colors meant something, numbers meant something, directions and language meant something. The order drew from an enormous collection of traditions and symbols, blending them together into a singular system that felt ancient, mysterious, and strangely complete. Egyptian imagery stood beside mystical Christianity, Jewish Kabbalah mixed with Hermetic philosophy, alchemy with astrology. Ancient symbols were arranged into lessons meant to reveal hidden laws, invisible and beneath ordinary reality. Members studied correspondences between planets, numbers, letters, elements, and spiritual ideas. A symbol on paper was never just a symbol. Ritual gesture was never just a movement. Everything connected. At least that was the promise. And perhaps the most seductive part of the Golden Dawn was this. It gave structure to mystery. Victorian society was changing at a dizzying speed. Religion felt very uncertain to many. Science answered some questions while creating entirely new ones. But inside the temple, uncertainty just disappeared. There was a system. There was a hierarchy, a path. Progress could be measured. You moved upward. You advanced. You gained access. Higher grades supposedly brought deeper understanding and closer proximity to the hidden truths. And with advancement came a subtle idea that quietly threaded itself throughout the order. Not everyone stood in the same place. Some people knew more. Some people progressed further. Some people were more spiritually developed. The initiated separated themselves from the uninitiated. The advanced separated themselves from the noobs. Those who climbed higher were believed to possess greater understanding. To members, this hierarchy represented discipline and wisdom, a roadmap toward enlightenment. But outside the temple walls, Europe was becoming increasingly obsessed with another kind of hierarchy. Not a spiritual one, but a human one. Questions about intelligence, bloodlines, civilization, fitness, who rises, who falls, who deserves power. And these ideas spread through scientific, political, and intellectual circles. Some people would blend them with older mystical ideas in ways that history would remember for far darker reasons. But before any of that happened, the Golden Dawn had a different problem. Its own members. Because secrecy has a way of attracting strong personalities. And before long, the order came home to poets, to mystics, and social elites. And one man who seemed absolutely engineered for conflict. Now, at first, the Golden Dawn seemed to offer exactly what Victorian society could not. Meaning, structure, mystery. Behind closed doors, members gathered not as businessmen, politicians, or socialites, but as initiates searching for hidden truths. And the people drawn into its orbit were anything but ordinary. This wasn't a society of isolated eccentrics whispering in basements. The order quietly attracted poets, actors, scholars, doctors, mystics, aristocrats, and ambitious intellectuals, people already moving through Britain's cultural elite, and among them was William Butler Yeats. Long before he became one of the most celebrated poets in the English-speaking world, Yeats was searching for something difficult to explain. He loved symbolism, invisible meanings hidden beneath ordinary life. Friends described him as thoughtful, intense, and often consumed by ideas much larger than himself. To Yeats, the Golden Dawn offered something irresistible. A language for mystery, a structure for imagination, a promise that poetry, spirituality, symbols, and hidden forces might all belong to some hidden architecture of reality. In meetings and rituals, Yeats immersed himself in the ceremonial study, the symbolism, mystical philosophy, and esoteric systems that would later leave fingerprints all over his writing. But he was not alone. There was also Florence Farr. And she was an actress, a director, a writer, and an intellectual force on her own inside the order. Sharp-minded and deeply respected, Farr became one of the organization's most influential members, helping shape rituals and internal practices while moving comfortably between London's aristocratic world and those occult circles. Then came Arthur Edward Waite, quiet, scholarly, and fascinated by symbolism and hidden spiritual systems. Waite would later leave a permanent mark on occult history through his association with what became one of the world's most recognizable tarot traditions. Now, inside the order, people debated meaning the way that other people debated politics. Symbols became arguments, philosophy became rivalry, mysticism became identity. And because beneath rituals and solemn language, the Golden Dawn was still made of human beings with egos. Ambition and jealousy, well, they crept on in. And secret societies have a problem that's older than secrecy itself. Eventually, everyone believes that they understand the truth better than anyone else. But still, for a time, the system worked. Meetings continued, members advanced through their grades, initiates passed through symbolic ceremonies designed to transform the self, and the order expanded. Its reputation spread quietly. To outsiders, almost nothing was known. To insiders, it felt like standing inside something ancient, grand, and important. Something hidden from the ordinary world, and then he arrived. He was young, brilliant, wealthy, and absolutely impossible to ignore. He was the kind of person who entered a room and immediately altered the gravity. His name? Aleister Crowley. And depending on who tells the story, he was either a genius, a fraud, a prophet, a narcissist, or possibly the most dangerous man in the room. And Crowley didn't enter the Golden Dawn quietly. He moved through occult circles with theatrical confidence, a sharp intelligence, and an obsessive hunger for hidden knowledge. He studied intensely and learned very quickly. He delighted in pushing the boundaries, and unlike many members who treated occult study with a polite restraint, Crowley approached it with an appetite. He wanted advancement. He wanted to access authority and secrets, and he wanted them now. To some members, he seemed brilliant. To others, highly arrogant, disturbing, untrustworthy. These were whispers, arguments, and personality clashes. Questions about legitimacy and power simmered beneath the order's calm surface. Because while members studied hidden wisdom and spiritual mastery, the Golden Dawn had quietly become something else. A pressure chamber, full of ambition, fragile alliances, competing visions, and enormous egos locked behind ritual secrecy. Then tensions inside the order began boiling over. Factions formed and authority fractured. Friendships collapsed, and before long, one of Britain's strangest secret societies would descend into accusations, betrayal, power struggles, and something dangerously close to civil war. Now, long before Crowley marched into the story, the Golden Dawn had already begun losing its architects. And most members barely realized what was happening. Of the three founding chiefs, Westcott, Mathers, and Woodman, the quietest figure disappeared first. Woodman had never possessed Mathers' dramatic intensity, nor Westcott's organizational obsession. Older than both men, dignified, scholarly, and deeply embedded in Rosicrucian and Masonic circles, he brought something invaluable to the order. Respectability. Stability. Gravitas. If Mathers was fire, Woodman felt like the structure. The reassuring Victorian elder that stood quietly behind the curtain, while younger personalities argued about the hidden wisdom. And then suddenly, he was gone. In December of 1891, only a few years after founding the Golden Dawn, Woodman died after a brief illness. He was only 63 years old. There was no dramatic scandal, no schism within the order, no betrayals, just an empty absence. And absence changes institutions, especially secret ones. His death left something subtle but important behind. Space for stronger personalities, space for conflict, and space for the authority to shift. No replacement fully stepped into Woodman's role among the original governing triad. Instead, the responsibilities quietly redistributed, increasingly concentrating influence around Mathers and Westcott. And at first, the order survived. But then came the second loss. Only this time, a founder didn't die. He withdrew. So in the mid-1890s, the Golden Dawn had become difficult to ignore. Its reputation had spread, and whispers moved. Occult societies fascinated the press. This posed a problem for Westcott because, unlike many of its members, Westcott had a serious public position. He was a London coroner, a representative of institutional authority, a man whose professional life depended on credibility and public trust. The accounts would differ in detail, but around 1896-1897, Westcott's superiors became aware of his occult involvement. Stories were circulating that material connected to the Golden Dawn or letters tied to occult activities had reached officials above him. Now, whether through accident, malice, or internal betrayal, this is remaining debated still. Some later speculation even suggested enemies within occult circles may have helped expose him, though certainty is impossible on any of these. A message, however, was clear. A crown coroner publicly associated with ritual magic, secret societies, and occult ceremonies, that's a problem. So Westcott stepped back, quietly, publicly withdrawing from active leadership in the order he helped create. And with that withdrawal, the balance, it changed drastically. Because once Westcott faded from view, something important disappeared with him. The administrator, the guy who mediated, the guy who organized, the bureaucratic spine that was holding all of these personalities together. What remained, it increasingly belonged to Mathers. Visionary, brilliant, and combative, but he was also far away living in Paris by this point. And when institutions lose their moderating voices, power has a way of becoming personal. So by the late 1890s, the Golden Dawn had become something legendary. You didn't stumble into it, though. You were invited. Its members guarded entrances carefully, passed through rituals in secret, and spoke in symbols strange enough to sound absurd to the outsiders, but sacred to believers. Inside temple rooms, hidden behind ordinary London addresses, initiates studied systems they believed could unlock reality itself. Ancient Egypt, astrology, alchemy, ceremonial magic, hidden correspondences connecting the stars to language and mathematics, to spirit and destiny. And somewhere inside the strange hidden world, whispers circulated about a young man who seemed almost designed to disrupt it. And even before he entered the order, Crowley already looked like trouble. Born into wealth in England, Crowley had grown up in a deeply religious household shaped by strict religious evangelical Christianity. The discipline, moral certainty, and religious obsession surrounded his childhood, and he hated almost all of it. Later in life, Crowley would describe much of his upbringing as suffocating, a world governed by judgment, repression, and spiritual fear. If childhood gave him anything, it may have been an obsession with rebellion. By the time he reached university, Crowley had become restless. He climbed mountains, he read obsessively, he wrote poetry, and he moved through intellectual circles with the kind of confidence that made admirers lean closer and critics roll their eyes. But underneath the confidence sat something harder to explain. Crowley wanted answers, and not ordinary answers. He wanted mastery, proof that hidden forces exist beneath ordinary life. And eventually, like many restless intellectuals of the age, he drifted towards occultism. He read everything he could: mysticism, magic, symbolism, alchemy, the hidden architecture of belief systems most educated societies treated with embarrassment or amusement at best. In 1898, Crowley entered the orbit of the Golden Dawn, and to understand why this matters, imagine what the order looked like through Crowley's eyes. This is a hidden society with secret teachings and ancient symbols. Ranks of initiation, ceremonies guarded from ordinary people with a knowledge that's only earned in layers. An elite system claiming access to truths invisible to the rest of humanity. And for someone like Crowley, it must have felt irresistible. Not just interesting, but necessary. He entered, and almost immediately people noticed him. Crowley didn't blend into rooms, he filled them. Tall, sharp-featured, very intense, and unapologetically self-assured. He carried himself like someone convinced he had arrived for a much larger purpose. Inside the order, personalities mattered. The Golden Dawn looked mystical from the outside, but internally it behaved much like any ambitious institution filled with intellectual elites. People judged one another, protected influence, measured seriousness, and they watched the newcomers carefully. Crowley gave them plenty to watch. He advanced quickly, and too quickly, a lot would say. He absorbed the teachings obsessively, devoured occult texts, and treated ritual study less like a hobby and more like combat training. Where some members approached mysticism carefully, politely, and academically, Crowley attacked it. He wanted that access. He wanted advancement. He wanted initiation into deeper mysteries immediately. To some senior members, his ambition felt unhealthy and obsessive. The order taught discipline, patience, and symbolic growth. Crowley seemed impatient with all three. Worse still, there was something absolutely theatrical about him. Even in ordinary life, Crowley seemed drawn toward intensity and spectacle. He enjoyed provocation and shocking people. He enjoyed being called the most wickedest man alive. He enjoyed his unusualness. And in a secret society already full of oversized personalities, this made him dangerous. So the Whispers followed him. He was too ambitious, too unstable, too eager, too untrustworthy. Some questioned whether he possessed the temperament for higher grades. Others just disliked him. And Crowley noticed. He always noticed. The London temples increasingly felt political. To Crowley, they felt petty and restrictive, a place where insecure gatekeepers hoarded knowledge while pretending to guard spiritual truth. Then across the channel, Crowley encountered someone very different. Someone who seemed to embody the very thing that the Golden Dawn had promised. Not bureaucracy or committees, but authority, mystery, and power. And that man was Mathers. And when the two had finally met, the future of the Golden Dawn began quietly moving towards collision. If London felt political to Crowley, Paris must have been magical. By the time Crowley crossed the Channel, the center of gravity inside the Golden Dawn had begun to shift. Technically, authority still rested inside the Order's temples and leadership structure. But spiritually, at least in the minds of many of the members, the most powerful figure in the movement was living hundreds of miles away in Paris. And depending on who you ask, Mathers was either a genius of ceremonial magic or a man dangerously close to disappearing inside of his own mythology. Mathers didn't resemble the quiet Victorian scholar. He cultivated intensity, ceremony, and presence. Friends and critics alike described someone theatrical, serious, and deeply committed to ritual, and utterly convinced that hidden forces shaped reality. He translated occult texts obsessively, studied magical systems with a near monastic devotion, and he spoke though ancient wisdom had not disappeared at all, that it had only hidden itself. To younger initiates, especially someone like Crowley, Mathers appeared almost mythic. Here was a man who didn't merely discuss secret knowledge, he lived it. Paris became Crowley's education, not a university, but an apprenticeship. Hours disappeared inside rooms crowded with manuscripts, ritual notes, translation diagrams, symbols, and ceremonial instructions copied and revised across years of occult study. Crowley found he believed what he had been searching for, someone who seemed to know the way forward. And the two men worked together closely, sometimes obsessively. Mathers had already devoted enormous effort to translating and preserving magical texts, and Crowley entered that world eagerly. Together they spent long stretches studying ritual systems, ceremonial structures, magical correspondences, and grimoires, which are manuals of ceremonial magic that centuries earlier had been treated with equal parts fascination and fear. Among the most important projects orbiting their work were texts tied to the ceremonial, evocation, and ritual disciplines, including traditions associated with the Book of Abramelin the Mage, a work describing long and difficult systems of spiritual preparation meant to place practitioners in contact with a higher spiritual intelligence before confronting darker forces. To outsiders, this would have sounded absurd. Two educated men in Europe at the dawn of modernity sitting over magical manuscripts while the industrial world accelerates around them. But to Mathers and Crowley, this work mattered. Every symbol carried meaning, every ritual had structure, every gesture supposedly reflected hidden laws beneath reality. If London members approached occultism like scholars, Crowley approached it like conquest. He studied relentlessly, memorized systems, pushed boundaries, and wanted more. He always wanted more. And Mathers, already increasingly frustrated with the criticisms coming from London, seemed to enjoy having a disciple who treated him less like an administrator and more like a master, because trouble was already growing inside the order. Back in London, senior members had begun whispering. Mathers lives all the way in Paris. He issues instructions remotely, claims spiritual authority through mystical secret chiefs, hidden adepts supposedly guiding the order through unseen means. For years, many accepted this. Now some had begun asking the uncomfortable question, who exactly were these secret chiefs? Could anyone verify them? Why did Mathers increasingly sound less like first among equals and more like unquestioned authority? And perhaps most dangerously, why did Crowley seem to gain special treatment? And the answer, at least from London's point of view, appeared obvious. Crowley had attached himself to Mathers, and Mathers had chosen his favorite. Inside temple circles, the resentment thickened, and Crowley's ambition already irritated people. His personality exhausted them. His speed through the grades they found unsettling. Now came rumors of private instruction, special access, preferential treatment to critics. Crowley no longer looked like a serious initiate. He looked like Mathers' weapon. Meanwhile, Crowley himself seemed increasingly convinced that London leadership represented everything wrong with the order. A bunch of petty gatekeepers. Bureaucrats pretending to guard sacred wisdom, more interested in procedure than power. Then came the moment that turned irritation into war. Crowley applied for advancement into one of the order's higher grades. The London Temple refused. To them, he lacked the maturity, the discipline, temperament, and the trustworthiness. To Crowley, this was a humiliation, and to Mathers, it was insubordination. And so, from Paris, Mathers made a decision that would crack the Golden Dawn right down the middle. He would advance Crowley himself. A decision that would send one furious occultist back to London and set the stage for one of the strangest power struggles in the history of secret societies. So the breaking point had arrived in January of 1900, and like so many collapses inside secret societies, it began with something deceptively simple. Someone wanted access. Crowley had asked for advancement into the higher inner order. The London adepts had said no. Mathers, furious at what he saw as an open defiance of his authority, responded from Paris by doing something absolutely explosive, which was that he initiated Crowley himself, not in London and not with the approval of the temple leadership. He did so in Paris, and when the ceremony ended, Mathers expected London to accept a founder's decision. Crowley certainly did. He returned to England convinced the matter was now settled. After all, who had greater authority than Mathers, the founder and master of ritual? The man who claimed contact with the hidden spiritual chiefs guiding the order from behind the veil. But London had reached a different conclusion. To many of its members, this was no longer merely about Crowley. It was about survival. Because if Mathers could simply elevate favorites from Paris and impose authority from afar, what authority then remained in the London temples at all? So inside temple meetings, tempers flared, members who had tolerated Crowley openly resented him by this point. And the atmosphere started to become poisonous. Letters moved back and forth, arguments were heard, friends became factions, and somewhere in the middle of all of it stood W.B. Yeats, the poet, the mystic, the initiate, and increasingly reluctant political player inside a magical civil war. Yeats had once admired much about the order, the symbolism, mystical structure, the search for hidden meaning. But now he watched internal politics consume everything. The lofty language of spiritual advancement was beginning to collapse under the ordinary human behavior. Then came Blythe Road. The address itself, it sounds forgettable, just another London street. But behind one ordinary doorway sat the Isis Urania Temple, the symbolic heart of the Golden Dawn in Britain. And one winter day, Crowley arrived there carrying Mathers' authority like it was a warrant. Crowley appeared dressed dramatically, Scottish Highland attire, ceremonial clothing, severe enough to leave a permanent impression on anyone that saw this. To sympathetic eyes, he looked like an initiate acting under a legitimate instruction. To critics, he looked absurd. A theatrical intruder arriving to seize control of a magical society. But Crowley was deadly serious. Mathers had empowered him to act, and he came to gain access to the temple materials, records, authority, whatever London seemed determined to deny him. Imagine the tension inside that building. No magical explosions, no glowing symbols, just human beings. Angry human beings. People had spent years studying hidden wisdom, now standing inside hallways, arguing over legitimacy, keys, access to power. The London members resisted, doors were locked, and Mather's authority was challenged. Crowley rejected. The confrontation spiraled into something bizarre and strangely tragic, because underneath the ceremonial language and the occult symbolism, everyone suddenly confronted an uncomfortable truth. The Golden Dawn did not know who controlled the Golden Dawn. Was the authority local? Did the London Temple govern itself? Or did Mathers rule over it from Paris? Could one founder override everyone else? And perhaps one of the more dangerous questions, had Mathers begun confusing spiritual authority with personal authority? Yeats found himself pulled deeper into conflict further than he'd ever expected. At one point, stories circulated that he had physically confronted Crowley. Later, legends exaggerated the scene into theatrical images, Sparta kicking him down staircases, and dramatic expulsions. The reality appears a bit less cinematic, but no less revealing. The confrontation was humiliating, messy, and deeply personal. People who once believed themselves guardians of ancient wisdom had devolved into factions fighting over rooms, documents, recognition, and who's legitimate. The temple that promised transcendence had become a place of politics. And after Blythe Road, there was no putting the order back together, because something worse had started happening. Members stopped whispering complaints, and they started investigating. If Mathers claimed a hidden authority, then maybe it was time to prove it. If the secret chiefs existed, who were they? If the order rested on these sacred foundations, where exactly had these foundations come from? And slowly, quietly, one dangerous suspicion began moving through the order like poison. What if the story at the center of everything wasn't what they thought? The cipher manuscripts, the hidden origins, the secret inheritance. For years, members treated these stories almost like scripture. Now members wanted answers, and when secret societies begin investigating their own myths, collapse is usually pretty close behind. Now, after Blythe Road, the Golden Dawn stopped feeling like a secret society united by hidden purpose. It became a battlefield. Quiet at first, polite on the surface, the Victorian. But underneath the letters, committee meetings, and formal language sat something raw. The feeling of betrayal. People who once stood beside one another in ritual chambers now questioned each other's honesty, motives, and legitimacy. The old ceremonies continued, and members still gathered. Symbols still hung on the temple's walls, and initiations still happened. But something had changed. Trust had fundamentally broken. And trust, more than ritual, had been holding the whole order together. At the center of the storm stood Mathers, still out in Paris, still insisting he possessed legitimate authority over the order. He believed London had mutinied. To him, rebellious members had forgotten discipline and challenged a structure they themselves barely understood. And he continued insisting that his authority came through contact with mysterious hidden adepts, the secret chiefs, spiritual intelligences, or concealed masters who supposedly guided the order from beyond ordinary perception. For years, members had tolerated this claim. Now tolerance turned into suspicion. Because frustration changes people, and when someone feels deceived, they start asking sharper questions. Who were the secret chiefs? Were they even real people, or some kind of spiritual entities? Were they a metaphor, or was it simply Mathers' justification for holding on to power? And if authority rested on these cipher manuscripts, where exactly had these manuscripts come from? Inside the London temples, the investigations began. Private discussions turned forensic. Letters were studied and claims got compared. Stories got tested. And among these increasingly involved and resisting Mathers were respected members including Florence Farr and W.B. Yeats. Some of the very people who had once helped sustain the order and now found themselves trapped inside a collapsing institution. The arguments no longer concerned symbolism or spiritual philosophy. They concerned governance, authority, evidence, and control. A secret society built around hidden truths suddenly could not agree on what truth even was. Then the fractures became permanent. The original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn began splitting into rival camps. Mathers retained loyal followers and reorganized parts of the movement into what became Alpha et Omega. This was a continuation in Mathers' eyes of the original spiritual mission. And to critics, it was just a competing branch built around loyalty to Mathers himself. Elsewhere, former Golden Dawn members reorganized. The movement splintered into successor bodies, including Stella Matutina, which preserved a lot of the ceremonial structures and the teachings, while attempting to move beyond the Civil War, consuming the old order. Other members followed different paths entirely. Among them, Arthur Edward Waite, increasingly distancing himself from what he saw was magical obsession, steering toward a more mystical, spiritual, symbolic interpretation of the esoteric practice. What was once a singular secret society slowly became several competing inheritances. Everyone claimed continuity and legitimacy. Everyone was claiming in one form or another to possess the real secrets of the Golden Dawn. Tensions spilled into public criticism, accusations, rival publications, reputational warfare, and some legal conflicts surrounded the authorship, ownership, and publication rights tied to occult writings and teachings. The magical Civil War had escaped the temple. If members of the Golden Dawn imagined their Civil War would remain hidden behind temple doors, they badly misunderstood Aleister Crowley. Because he had discovered something very powerful. Secrets lose their power once they're printed. And Crowley, he loved to print things. Years after the Order fractured, Crowley began publishing material connected to the Golden Dawn's rituals, teachings, and initiatory practices inside a journal called The Equinox. To outsiders, it looked bizarre. Diagrams, ceremonies, occult language, strange symbolic systems few ordinary people could even decipher. But to the former members of the Golden Dawn, this was explosive. Material that was once guarded behind initiation vows had begun to appear in print. Things whispered in ritual chambers could suddenly be bought, read, and studied. The locked doors of the temple had been kicked open, and somewhere in Paris, Mathers was furious. To him, Crowley had crossed a line. This was a betrayal. The student had taken the guarded material and carried it into public view. And so in 1910, the magical Civil War took an almost unbelievable turn, and it entered into a courtroom. Imagine the absurdity for a moment. A secret occult order built around silence, hidden knowledge, coded authority, and ritual secrecy, now dragged into legal proceedings? The argument at its core revolved around ownership, though. Who controlled the teachings? Who possessed the right to publish them? Did the rituals belong to Mathers, to the Order, to Crowley, or to no one at all? Mathers attempted to stop publication, objecting to Crowley reproducing Golden Dawn materials in his Equinox. Crowley resisted, he didn't care. And in a deeply ironic twist, a dispute born inside hidden temples suddenly depended not on mystical authority, but legal proof. Courtrooms are cold places for mysticism. Judges do not care about secret chiefs. Paperwork, evidence, and ownership are what matters. And when the dust settled, Crowley won. Mathers failed to stop the publication effort, and the case ended in Crowley's favor. Instead of protecting secrecy, the lawsuit only drew more attention to the fact that occult material, once treated like sacred knowledge, was now public enough to argue about in court. For Crowley, the moment felt almost symbolic. The rebellious initiate had defeated the master. The gatekeeper had lost control of the gate. And for the Golden Dawn's mythology, the damage was profound, because something had quietly died. Not just secrecy, but authority. The old image of hidden adepts protecting untouchable mysteries had cracked. The order that once promised hidden wisdom now looked painfully human. Former allies arguing over intellectual property, occultists hiring lawyers, secret teachings discussed on public record, and maybe nothing captured the tragedy of the Golden Dawn better than that image. A magical order obsessed with hidden truth, ending not in revelation, but in litigation. By the early 20th century, the original Golden Dawn, the organization founded in 1888 with the promise of hidden wisdom and initiatory transformation, had effectively ceased to exist. Not destroyed by governments, not exposed by enemies, not dismantled by scandals alone, but slowly consumed by something painfully ordinary. Human nature. The need to be right. The need to lead. The need to be the sole possessor of truth. For all its rituals devoted to spiritual mastery, its greatest test turned out to be profoundly human. But still, the Golden Dawn did not vanish. Its members scattered, the rituals survived, and the symbols spread. Its ideas migrated into books, into lodges, successor groups, private circles, and the imagination of future occultists. And as Europe stepped into the darker century, some of these ideas, especially ideas about hidden hierarchy, advancement, destiny, and human development, would begin intersecting with something happening far beyond temple walls, something that believed humanity itself could be improved. And by the time the dust settled, the Golden Dawn was no longer one thing. The temples had fractured, the personalities had scattered, the rivalries had hardened into separate movements. And yet, strangely, the Order refused to die. Its rituals survived, its symbols survived. Its teachings escaped confinement. Fragments of the Golden Dawn moved outward through books, private societies, lectures, manuscripts, and the memoirs and memories of few former initiates who carried pieces of the system to new corners of the occult world. The Order had shattered, but its fingerprints remained everywhere. Former members rebuilt, reinterpreted, and repackaged. Some sought stricter ceremonial systems, some pursued mysticism over ritual, some drifted towards symbolism, psychology, spirituality, or personal transformation. And beneath all of it lingered ideas that the Order had helped popularize: hierarchy, initiation, hidden advancement, the belief that the truth existed in layers, and that knowledge separated the initiate from the ordinary. That human beings progress through discipline, symbolism, wisdom, or spiritual development. And inside the Golden Dawn, these ideas largely were inward-facing. An initiate climbed symbolically. You advanced through grades, studied and disciplined yourself. You sought enlightenment. In theory, spiritual hierarchy, not social hierarchy. But ideas, they rarely stay contained, and the late 19th century and early 20th centuries were already saturated with a different obsession: human improvement. Now, across Europe and the United States, educated society increasingly debated heredity, degeneration, civilization, progress, and biological fitness. What makes a society strong? What weakens a society? Can civilization improve itself? Then suddenly, the strange parallels began appearing between worlds that otherwise looked unrelated. Occult circles talked about advancement. Political theorists talked about progress. Nationalists talked about destiny. Scientists discussed heredity. Eugenicists discussed improvement. The language changed depending on the room. But the themes, they echoed: hierarchy, development, purity, degeneration, the fear of decline, the promise of ascent. And meanwhile, in German-speaking Europe, occult thinkers began moving these ideas somewhere darker. The figures like Guido von List and George Lansver Liebenfeld constructed strange systems blending mythology, nationalism, ancestral identity, spiritual destiny, and racial hierarchy. And these ancient symbols became markers of imagined bloodlines. Mysticism mixed with pseudoscience. Spiritual elitism blurred into biological elitism. These movements were not the Golden Dawn, not even particularly close to the Golden Dawn in ritual practice. But they emerged from a much broader European fascination with the hidden truths, with hierarchy, ancestry, and human destiny, as well as human potential. The Golden Dawn searched for hidden wisdom. Others searched for hidden superiority. And somewhere between mysticism, nationalism, pseudoscience, and fear, ideas about higher and lower people stopped being symbolic and they started becoming political, bureaucratic, and then catastrophic. Later in 20th century Germany, men such as Heinrich Himmler would absorb parts of an already existing cultural atmosphere steeped in mythic ancestry, symbolism, hierarchy, Volkish identity, and racial identity. Not because the Golden Dawn secretly engineered Nazism, not because hidden adepts whispered instructions into politics, but because Europe had become crowded with movements trying to explain civilization through hidden structures, whether spiritual, biological, national, or racial. And once power entered the equation, these ideas began changing shape. Secret societies are fascinating because they feel distant, they feel exotic and hidden. But history rarely moves through just one secret room at a time. It moves through culture and conversations, through books, institutions, through ordinary people convincing themselves that some lives matter more than others. Does this sound familiar, my fellow Americans? It's maybe the strangest legacy of the Golden Dawn. Not that it secretly shaped the modern world, but that it existed at the edge of a century obsessed with these hidden systems, with the advancement, the hierarchy, the transformation and classification of everything. A century that takes some of these ideas to some unimaginably dark places, because once humanity starts dividing itself into the enlightened and unenlightened, the worthy and the unworthy, well, history has shown more than once how dangerous that road can become. So, how did a secret occult order obsessed with hidden knowledge end up intersecting with the ideas that helped shape some of the darkest ideologies of the 20th century? The answer is a bit stranger and less dramatic than conspiracy stories would have you believe. Because the story taught us anything, it is this one thing, that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they were never a hidden government. They were never a secret machine quietly steering world history from candlelit rooms. Its members weren't secretly designing the future of Europe. They were poets, mystics, doctors, actors, writers, and intellectuals. Brilliant in some places and petty as hell in others. All searching for meaning in an age moving too fast to understand. They fought and obsessed. They argued over symbols, authority, legitimacy, and truth. They built a system meant to reveal hidden wisdom, and then nearly destroyed one another fighting over who got to possess it. But to dismiss the Golden Dawn as an eccentric theater misses the point entirely, because ideas do matter, even the strange ones. The order existed during a moment when history in Europe became obsessed with these systems, with systems of knowledge, of ranking, and progress. Systems promising hidden explanations for why people rise, why civilizations fall, why societies weaken and greatness disappears. Inside the Golden Dawn, you climb towards wisdom. Outside the temple, similar language slowly entered politics, nationalism, pseudoscience, and social engineering. There, hierarchy stopped being a metaphor, and people began sorting humans themselves, ranking populations, measuring worth, talking openly about improvement. The Golden Dawn did not create those beliefs, but it lived inside the same historical weather, the same cultural storm. And when darker movements emerged in the 20th century, some echoes sounded familiar, not because one secret order caused history, but because history often builds from overlapping obsessions. The belief that hidden laws determine who deserves to rise. That is an uncomfortable part of this story, because we prefer villains wearing costumes, secret symbols, and dark rituals done in hidden chambers. It feels safer that way. If evil belongs to secret societies, then ordinary society, we remain innocent. But history rarely gives us that comfort. The truth is more human and more dangerous. Bad ideas don't arrive announcing themselves as evil. They arrive sounding intelligent, scientific, necessary, protective, or even moral. They flatter people. They promise order and certainty. They promise that complicated problems can be solved if someone is brave enough to divide humanity into categories. The worthy from the unworthy. Us and them. And that is a very real shadow left behind by stories like the Golden Dawn. Not magic, not their secret rituals, but the warning. Because every generation becomes tempted by systems promising hidden truths, a shortcut to certainty, an explanation for suffering, a reason some people should lead while others follow. And every generation, they have to decide where that road ends. The founders likely believed that they were building a path toward enlightenment. Instead, they built something stranger, a mythology, a fractured inheritance that still fascinates people more than a century later. A secret order born in Victorian London that promised hidden wisdom, and it collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. And it left behind a question history still struggles to answer. When people become convinced that they alone possess truth, what happens next?